Welcome. My name is Megan Takashima, a TA provider with Apt Associates. This webinar will provide details on implementing preferences and limitations in HOME-ARP, including implementation examples. Specifically, the agenda for this webinar is to define preferences, limitations, and methods of prioritization, review the process for establishing a preference, method of prioritization, or a limitation in the allocation plan, discuss the participating jurisdictions, or PJ's, responsibility to ensure that preferences and limitations align with fair housing and civil rights laws, and through examples, offer approaches to operationalizing preferences and limitations based on the outcome of the consultation and gaps analysis. We will begin by expanding on preferences and limitations in HOME-ARP. But first, we will quickly review the HOME-ARP qualifying populations, or QPs. The QPs include those homeless as defined by 24 CFR 91.5, homeless definitions 1, 2, or 3, those at risk of homelessness as defined by 24 CFR 91.5, persons fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking as defined by HUD in 24 CFR 5.2003, and other populations, including families requiring services or housing assistance to prevent homelessness, as well as those at greatest risk of housing instability. HOME-ARP statute requires PJ programs to provide all 4 QPs with access to HOME-ARP projects and activities. PJs must allow all 4 QPs to apply for or be referred to HOME-ARP projects or activities. PJs may not exclude or remove the eligibility of any QP from its HOME-ARP program. However, a PJ may use preferences or limitations for specific projects or activities if all of the following are true. There are unmet housing needs and/or service gaps for a specific QP that can be best met through preferences or limitations. The preference or limitation complies with the Notice and Fair Housing and Civil Rights laws. The PJ discloses it in its allocation plan and HUD approves. Neither a preference nor a limitation makes anyone eligible for assistance that does not otherwise qualify as a QP. Preferences establish the order in which QP applicants are admitted to HOME-ARP housing or non-congregate shelter, or provided with HOME-ARP TBRA or services. HOME-ARP permits PJs to establish reasonable preferences among the 4 QPs, for example, for the homeless QP or other populations QP, or for a subpopulation of a QP, to prioritize applicants within 1 or more QPs. An example of a preference would be a PJ issuing a HOME-ARP NOFO for projects that will serve all QPs, but provides additional points to projects that have a preference for individuals and families that qualify for the homeless QP. Limitations serve to exclude certain QPs or subpopulations of QPs from eligibility for a project or activity. Limitations can make it difficult for PJs to meet the HOME-ARP statutory intent to provide all 4 QPs with access to HOME-ARP. Thus, PJs should not impose a limitation unless it is necessary to address an unmet need or gap in effective housing or services in the PJ's jurisdiction. The identified gap cannot be addressed using a preference, and the PJ has justified these needs in its allocation plan. An example of a limitation would be a non-congregate shelter project limited to households in the domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking QP, if safety and confidentiality cannot be ensured without a limitation on eligibility. There are some key differences between limitations and preferences. Preferences establish priorities among QPs or for subpopulations of QPs for HOME-ARP assistance. A preference permits an eligible QP applicant that qualifies for a preference to be selected before another eligible QP applicant that does not qualify for the preference. If there are not sufficient applicants that meet the preference and there is an opening in the project or activity, an applicant from a QP that isn't the preference QP would be enrolled in the opening. A preference does not exclude an individual or household that qualifies under any of the QB definitions from applying. On the other hand, limitations restrict eligibility for a HOME-ARP project or activity to a certain QP or subpopulation of the QP. Limitations exclude the other QPs or subpopulations of QPs from eligibility for a project or activity, meaning they cannot apply. A PJ may designate preferences or limitations for HOME-ARP projects or activities if the unmet need and gaps analysis support the preference or limitation, all QP populations have access to the PJ's overall HOME-ARP program, there are no violations of applicable fair housing, civil rights, or non-discrimination laws, the PJ discloses the preference or limitation and method of prioritization in the allocation plan. PJ should clearly define the preference so that the public and HUD can determine who would receive priority, and HUD accepts the allocation plan. If preferences or limitations are not established by the PJ, applicants from any of the QP populations must be selected from a project-specific or activity-specific waiting list in chronological order to the extent practicable. A method of prioritization is the process by which eligible QP applicants who qualify for the same or different preferences are selected for a HOME-ARP project or activity. PJs must determine whether QPs within a designated preference will be provided assistance in chronological order or use a method of prioritization to determine the order assistance will be provided to households. If coordinated entry will be a source for referrals, prioritization in the CE system needs to be identified as a method of prioritization. An example of a method of prioritization is adopting a preference for the chronically homeless QP households for a HOME-ARP rental housing project, where QP applicants who qualify for the preference are prioritized for occupancy based on the length of time they have been homeless. We will now present a framework to establish and implement preferences and limitations in this next section of the webinar. The steps outlined here display a framework for how to implement preferences and/or limitations. The first step is to identify unmet need, gaps, and priorities through consultation and needs assessment. Specifically, this includes conducting consultation, assessing needs, identifying gaps, and establishing priorities. Secondly, review the need for preferences or limitations to meet identified needs. Identify eligible activities to fund, ensure fair housing compliance, consider methods of prioritization, and determine that the PJ's overall HOME-ARP program provides access to all QPs. The third step is to specify the preferences and limitations in the allocation plan. This includes describing preferences or limitations and methods of prioritization, justifying them based on the needs assessment and gaps analysis, publishing the plan for public comment, and submitting the plan to HUD for approval. It should be noted that if preferences or limitations are identified after plan approval, a substantial amendment would be necessary to amend the plan to reflect these changes. Finally, after plan approval, you must operationalize preferences or limitations. This includes, first, working with the COC coordinated entry entity to expand, if applicable. Secondly, establishing policies and procedures for referral methods. Third is executing written agreements with the entity operating the HOME-ARP project or activity. These written agreements must identify approved preferences or limitations and specify the method of prioritization. We will walk through each step in more detail in the following slides. The first step is to identify priorities through the consultation and needs assessment. Before establishing preferences or limitations, the PJ must consult with required organizations and conduct a needs assessment and gaps analysis to gather information and analyze the size and demographics of the 4 QPs in its community and their housing, shelter, and service needs, the existing housing and shelter inventory as well as services being provided, any gaps that exist within the existing shelter and housing inventory, as well as the service delivery system. Based on the outcome of the consultation, the needs assessment, and the gaps analysis, the PJ can establish priorities for its HOME-ARP program and determine if preferences or limitations are necessary to address needs. The second step is to review the need for preferences or limitations to meet identified need. After identifying eligible activities to fund, the PJ should determine whether a preference or limitation is necessary to address a greater gap in benefits and services, a gap in shelter, housing, or services for a QP or QP subpopulation, and review for compliance with fair housing and non-discrimination. We will talk in more detail about fair housing and non-discrimination on the next slide. The PJ should also consider methods of prioritization to implement. Remember that a method of prioritization is the process by which eligible QP applicants who qualify for the same or different preferences are selected for a HOME-ARP project or activity. If a method of prioritization will be used, it must be established in the allocation plan. Without it, a PJ admits applicants to the HOME-ARP project or activities in chronological order. Although referral methods are not required to be identified in the allocation plan, PJ should also consider how preferences and methods of prioritization will be implemented through referral methods. It's important to think about referral methods during the planning process if the PJ may use the coordinated entry system for any projects or activities, because existing coordinated entry systems implement preferences and methods of prioritization. The PJ must ensure that its overall HOME-ARP program is available to all QP populations, notwithstanding preferences or limitations applicable to an individual project or activity. PJs are not required to talk about projects or activities in the plan, although they may often have specific projects or activities in mind. Before moving forward to step 3, the PJ must assess preferences or limitation for compliance with Notice CPD-21-10, Section 4C, Federal Fair Housing Laws and Implementing Regulations, including the Fair Housing Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, HUD's Equal Access Rule, Age Discrimination Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any state or local fair housing and non-discrimination requirements must also be considered. Note that some preferences or limitations may violate fair housing, civil rights, and non-discrimination laws. Some examples include single-sex housing or non-congregate shelter, adults-only housing or non-congregate shelter, or housing or shelter that is limited for persons with a specific disability. Preferences that violate non-discrimination laws cannot be implemented. HUD strongly recommends consultation with the HUD Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Division of your field office before establishing a preference or limitations that may have a fair housing or civil right implication. Step 3 is to specify preferences or limitations that may be used for HOME-ARP projects or activities. These must be described in the plan and justified based on the PJ's needs assessment. Explain how preferences or limitations will address unmet needs or gaps consistent with the needs assessment. Establish any methods of prioritization that will be implemented. Describe how the PJ will address unmet needs or gaps of the other QPs, and indicate whether a method of prioritization will be used. If a PJ does not identify and justify preferences or limitations in the allocation plan, or doesn't state the method of priority for preferences, it is prohibited from implementing preferences, limitations, or methods of prioritization. The PJ's plan must be published for public comment, and following the public comment period, the PJ must submit the plan to HUD for approval. The fourth step is to operationalize preferences or limitations following plan approval. If applicable, the PJ will enter into a written agreement with the coordinated entry system to ensure expansion and that the coordinated entry system will follow the PJ's preferences and methods of prioritization. The PJ will determine appropriate preferences, limitations, methods of prioritization, and referral methods for each project or activity. The PJ must enter into a written agreement with each subrecipient or project owner that meets the requirements of CPD-21-10, including a description of any preference or limitation to be implemented, including the specific QPs and/or subpopulations of a QP, the referral methods to be used, the method of prioritization or process for selection, including the specific criteria to be used in sufficient detail for determining the order of referrals. We will now apply the framework outlined above to two community examples. The first example community is the Franklin PJ. As we discuss this example, we will share one of the needs identified and supported through consultation, needs assessment, and gaps analysis for the Franklin PJ. While this example will focus on the implementation of an activity to address this need, communities may identify a variety of needs during this process. The Franklin PJ has sufficient HOME-ARP funds for a variety of projects and activities based on its allocation. During the consultation process, the PJ heard from several entities that the most prominent need for the homeless QP is additional permanent housing resources and services. Street outreach workers noticed there was a high number of unsheltered households who had been homeless for several years and would likely need supportive services to remain housed. The entities recommend development of permanent supportive housing to address the needs of the homeless QP. The needs assessment demonstrates that there is a need for housing for the homeless QP. The gaps analysis demonstrated a gap in units for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. The Franklin PJ also determines that there is a need for services, as housing without supports may result in returns to homelessness for the homeless QP based on information provided during the consultation. This is one of the local needs identified and supported through consultation, the needs assessment, and gaps analysis process. As part of step 2 in the process, the PJ reviews the need for preferences or limitations to meet the identified needs. Based on the needs it identified, the Franklin PJ intends to allocate some of the HOME-ARP funds for rental housing. In addition, the Franklin PJ will allocate HOME-ARP funds for supportive services to be provided to the occupants of the HOME-ARP rental housing. The PJ will establish a preference for the homeless QP. The length of time homeless is used as a method of prioritization within the homeless QP. All other QPs will be accepted in chronological order. The PJ consults with the FHEO division in their local HUD field office before establishing the preference, and FHEO confirms that the preference does not violate fair housing or civil rights laws. The Franklin PJ considers the use of an expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral source and meets with the COC to familiarize them with HOME-ARP requirements and align methods of prioritization. The coordinated entry covers all of the PJ's geographic area. The COC is agreeable to expand coordinated entry to serve all 4 QPs and use the HOME-ARP QP definitions. The coordinated entry system uses a common assessment tool. This tool is used with the household's length of time homeless as the methods of prioritization. Based on the local needs, the Franklin PJ specifies a preference for the homeless QP for this project in its allocation plan and identifies that all other QPs will be served in chronological order. In the allocation plan, the PJ identifies HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral source. It describes the coordinated entry system's existing common assessment tool in detail and identifies it and the length of time homeless as prioritization factors. The PJ notes that the coordinated entry system intends to expand to serve all 4 qualifying populations and covers the PJ's entire geography. It identifies the preference will be included in the RFP process. The PJ publishes the plan for public comment, and after the public comment period, the PJ submits the plan for HUD approval. Following acceptance of the plan and obligation of the funds, the Franklin PJ issues an RFP for the development of HOME-ARP rental housing with supportive services for all QPs. The RFP awards additional points for projects that create a preference for the homeless QP. The RFP will describe expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral source. If there are no applicants in the homeless QP, all other QPs will be accepted in chronological order. To implement the preference, the PJ executes a written agreement with the COC to specify the requirements to expand to include all 4 QPs, identify the preference for the homeless QP and the method of prioritization to be used, and the PJ's affirmative marketing requirements. The PJ executes written agreements with the selected project owner or developer to impose the requirements of CPD-21-10, including the use of coordinated entry as the sole referral method, the preference for the homeless QP, and the method of prioritization based on the common assessment tool and the length of time homeless. The second example participating jurisdiction is the Springfield PJ. The Springfield PJ is considering a variety of options to provide access to HOME-ARP assistance to the 4 QPs. However, one need that has been identified may require a limitation. During the consultation process, the PJ heard from several entities that there was a significant need for emergency shelter for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking, referred to in this presentation as the DV Sexual Assault and Trafficking QP. A local shelter that specifically served victims of domestic violence had closed about 3 years ago, creating a gap in available shelter beds for the DV Sexual Assault and Trafficking QP. There were also safety concerns expressed regarding existing shelter lacking sufficient security and confidentiality processes. The entities consulted recommended the development of non-congregate shelter to meet the needs of the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP. The needs assessment demonstrates that there is limited and inadequate shelter access for households in the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP. Consultation with service providers also established that providing shelter for the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP with other QPs will create safety and confidentiality concerns that will inhibit the PJ's ability to meet the unique needs of the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP. The gaps analysis supported the provider's comments about available resources for the DV Sexual Assault and Trafficking QP. The PJ determines that it will allocate HOME-ARP funds for a non-congregate shelter that is limited to serving the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP. The Springfield PJ consults with the Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Division in their local HUD field office before establishing the limitation, and the FHEO confirms that the limitation does not violate fair housing or civil rights laws. The Springfield PJ plans to use coordinated entry and other referral methods for the project after hearing in the consultation that there are a variety of entities that interact with the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP. A violence risk assessment will be used as a method of prioritization within the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP for available non-congregate shelter. The PJ will ensure access to all QPs with other proposed HOME-ARP projects and activities. The Springfield PJ outlines the details of the consultation, needs assessment, and gaps analysis to support the decision to limit the non-congregate shelter to the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP in their allocation plan. The PJ identifies an RFP process as the method of soliciting project proposals with this type of limitation. The PJ establishes the preference and describes the violence risk assessment tool that will be used as the method of prioritization in the allocation plan. They also describe the use of coordinated entry with other referral methods. Once complete, the PJ publishes the plan for public comment, and after the comment period, submits the plan to HUD. Following acceptance of the allocation plan and obligation of the HOME-ARP funds, the Springfield PJ issues an RFP for a developer to construct a non-congregate shelter for the QP. The selected project owner or developer is a DV organization who has secured funding to operate the facility once completed. The DV organization will manage the project-specific waiting list and use a violence risk assessment that includes all of the populations served by the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP to determine the order of assistance. Referrals are made by a variety of service organizations, the coordinated entry system, police departments, and hospitals, as well as community providers to ensure that all households that qualify for the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP are able to apply or be referred. The PJ executes a written agreement with the project owner that meets the requirements of CPD-21-10, including the limitation on eligibility to the DV Sexual Assault Trafficking QP, the method of prioritization based on the violence risk assessment, and the use of coordinated entry with other referral methods, which will provide referrals to a project-specific waiting list maintained by the project owner. Some key takeaways about implementing preferences and limitations in HOME-ARP are provided on the next slide. PJs should carefully consider the need for preferences, methods of prioritization, and limitation based on information obtained through consultation, the needs assessment, and gaps analysis process. Before establishing or implementing a preference, method of prioritization, or limitation, the PJ must ensure that it will not violate any applicable fair housing or civil rights laws and regulations. PJs must thoroughly describe and justify preferences, methods of prioritization, or limitations in the allocation plan. PJs who have additional questions should contact their HUD field office or HOME-ARP at HUD.gov. The resources on this slide may be helpful to refer to for further details and guidance on the implementation of preferences or limitations. This material is based upon work supported, in whole or in part, by Federal Award Number Z21-TAMD-0001, awarded to APT Associates by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The substance and finding of the work are dedicated to the public. Neither the United States government nor any of its employees make any warranty, express or implied, or assumes any legal liability or responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, or usefulness of any information, apparatus, product, or process disclosed, or represents that it would not infringe upon privately owned rights. Reference herein to any individuals, agencies, companies, products, process, services, service by trade name, trademark, manufacturer, or otherwise does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the authors, contributors, the U.S. government, or any agency thereof. Opinions contained herein are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official position of, or a position that it is endorsed by, HUD or any other federal agency.